Thomas is a psychologist and a psychotherapist as well, with degrees from the University of Vienna and the UCL in the UK. Now he works as an assistant professor at the Sigmund Freud University, as I mentioned earlier. And his research revolves around topics of consciousness, clinical, psychological topics, having to do with addictions and social anxiety as well. So the floor is yours.
Good morning and welcome to my talk. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research to the name research community. I'm very excited about this opportunity. And I will be talking about a topic that might be new for many of you. It hasn't been around for very long. I'm very excited about this topic. And I will give you some details in a moment. My name is Thomas Ditye. I'm a psychologist. I work at Sigmund Freud University in Vienna in Austria. So what is it that I'm going to talk about today? The topic of Alexinomia. I would like to introduce it to you. It's the fear of saying personal names. Okay. I would like to start with a quote that might give you a first impression of what it might feel like, or it feels like this to one of the people we spoke to who have Alexinomia. And they said, "It has always been like that, as long as I can remember. I couldn't address others with their names, and it took extreme efforts to try. I became really conscious of it when I met my husband. I wanted to address him by name, but I could not do it. That's when I realized that I have a problem, that I can't say other people's names." This research on this topic started a couple of years ago. In 2022, I was talking to a friend and a colleague. Her name is Lisa Veleshik, and she introduced me to something that she came across several times in her psychotherapy clients. Some of her clients would tell her in the psychotherapy that they cannot say names of people they know and names they would like to say. And we found it quite interesting and started researching it and found out that on the one hand, there are quite a few records and reports of people who have this problem that you can find online when you look for it in forums and so on. However, there is no scientific documentation of it. It doesn't have a name, it hasn't been described. Psychological literature, other types of disciplines literature, we couldn't find anything, almost nothing. And then we started with the first study, which was an interview study. We invited people who have this problem to our lab and spoke with them and did a qualitative analysis of those interviews. And the results of that I would like to show to you alongside other things that I would like to show to you in this talk. So what is Alexinomia in the first place? Well, it is not a cognitive problem or a neurological problem, a memory impairment or a language impairment. It doesn't have to do anything with that. It's a psychological impairment that is characterized by knowing a name, but being unable to use it in personal communication. Affected individuals would like to say the name. They would like to say something like, "Good morning, Thomas," or "How are you doing, Susan?" or "Lisa, what do you think?" They would like to use first personal names in conversation like it is common, at least in our culture, in English language, German language, which are the languages that we studied. It's quite common to use names, right? However, they can't do it. Why can't they do it? Because they experience anxiety. It feels weird. It feels awkward. It feels too close, too intimate. It might come across too emotional. So there is a barrier that makes them avoid names. A topic related to that, of course, is the topic of name avoidance. Maybe you are well aware what that is. And this has been described in the literature, mostly anthropological research that looked into this. That's when people don't use names of other people because there is some sort of hierarchy, or it might be impolite in a certain culture to use a name. So, for example, naming a superior, or I'm saying the name of God or something like that. Well, it is related. This phenomenon of name avoidance might be related to Alexinomia, but we don't consider it quite the same thing because, as I was saying, Alexinomia is characterized by knowing a name, wanting to say it, but making the experience that it's impossible. The term Alexinomia stems from Greek language, and it means no words for names. So that was the introduction, what it is. And now I would like to show you 3 studies that we conducted and which produced interesting results. The first one is this interview study that I already mentioned. It's about qualitative interviews with affected individuals. The second study is going to be an internet research study where we analyzed reports and materials that we found online on the topic. And then I would like to show the newest study that investigated how Alexinomia is linked to social anxiety. The first study used qualitative interviews of 13 affected individuals. These happened to be all women because it was easier to find women in this case. And we spoke with them about an hour about all of their experiences with the phenomenon of not being able to say personal names. It's a rather small sample, obviously, only 13. But as a first explorative qualitative study, it was still quite interesting what we found. What we found was, first, the general characteristics. What is it exactly that people experience when they cannot say names? And how does it occur? In what type of relationships does it occur? When is the onset? What is the duration? What is the severity? And so on. So first of all, we found that it can occur in all relationships. However, for most people, the problem seems to be more severe in close, especially romantic relationships. So romantic partners, 25 years of marriage, maybe never have said each other's name, or one person has never said the name of the other person. So it becomes more severe the closer the relationship is. For most individuals, however, there are people whose names they can say. Relationships that are not, for some reason, are not affected by the problem. For example, names of siblings or animals, pet animals, something like that. What forms of communication are affected? Mostly direct verbal communication. It can appear also in written language and in other forms of communication, but the strongest one, the most severe one, is having to say the name directly to the person that you're talking to. Using nicknames can help in some cases, but not in all cases, right? Some people said that this is a way to get around the problem, is just using a nickname, but others were saying that they cannot use nicknames also. We found that the onset of the phenomenon often is associated with the first romantic relationship, that people start noticing, I cannot say my partner's name, and this is when they notice. Others are saying that they knew for a long time because it kind of has always been there, even in kindergarten, and at a very, very young age, they realized that they don't like saying names. Names are avoided because of the anxiety that comes with it. People are putting a lot of effort into hiding the problem. how does this show up in when people are starting a conversation, for instance, in a situation when names would be normally be used? Well, they could start talking without using the name, right? Just start talking, or try to get attention by eye contact or physical touch, or stay silent. Many of the affected people we spoke with would say that they sometimes just stay silent because they cannot start a conversation because of that. If the behavior is noticed by others, they might run into a misconception of thinking that the other person doesn't care very much, is a little bit distant or not very personal. And this is something that creates a huge burden for those who have it, because especially in romantic relationships, it's exactly the other way around. They feel the closeness and they feel the love and they would like to show affection and they would like to use a name, but they can't because it's in fact too emotional rather than too little emotion. If others notice and point out, why don't you ever say my name? I have a name. I'm not hey, I'm not hi. Why don't you use my name? It creates a huge discomfort in those who have it. It elicits feelings of shame, of guilt, of inadequacy, quite, quite serious feelings of embarrassment and shame. Here are some more quotes, but I'm not going to read them out, but you will have it in the slides and you can read them. These are all from different participants of this interview study. In this first study, we also collected data from questionnaires, from psychological standardized questionnaires measuring certain psychological constructs. The first one from the Big Five, extraversion came out significantly. So our group of subjects affected individuals of Alexinomia were less extroverted than the norm sample. So it just shows that they are less extroverted. Also, all of our subjects, of these first 13 subjects, were beyond the cutoff of social anxiety. Social anxiety is anxiety experienced during the interaction with others, being observed, being evaluated by others, small talk, things like that. And all of our subjects were beyond the threshold of social anxiety. So this was a very strong indication that social anxiety might play a very important role. We also tested what is called the differentiation of self. It's how individuals are dealing with emotions. And we found 3 significant results in 3 of the dimensions that it measures. These dimensions were emotional reactivity, emotional cutoff, and fusion with others. And our sample was significantly different from the healthy norm sample that this instrument was created with. We also measured how people with Alexinomia experience themselves in close relationships, and it turns out that they had stronger levels, higher levels of what is called attachment-related anxiety and attachment-related avoidance. So relationships, attachment, getting too close to someone is an issue here. That was the first study. That was the interview study. And then we did a second study where we were looking at online materials. We were searching for anything that we could find related to not being able to say names. And we found a few things, a few sources in forums, in blogs, in Facebook groups, and so on. And we would collect all of that and also analyze it with a qualitative method, the same method that we used for the interviews. And here also, we found pretty much the same things that we found in the interviews. However, there were also a few new things that came up. So, for example, it turned out that many of the people who would be writing about this problem online also said that they had a diagnosis from the autism spectrum, right? So they were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Also, what came up quite a lot online was some people had very severe problems with their own name, saying their own name, and with the attitude, their attitude towards their own name. They did not like their own name very often. Also, we found that in relationships that are affected, it's quite common that both partners don't use each other's names. That was the second study. Now let's turn to the third study that I would like to share with you. And that was looking into more specifically what is the relationship between alexinomia and social anxiety. So again, what is social anxiety? The fear and the avoidance of the evaluation of others, of social interactions, of being observed, performing in front of others, and so on. Here in this study, we tested 190 participants with different degrees and severities of social anxiety and correlated it with their levels of alexinomia. We used two scales to measure social anxiety, the social interaction and anxiety scale and the Leibovitz social anxiety scale. Here are the results. What you see here is a scatter plot of social anxiety versus alexinomia, and you can see the higher the social anxiety in both measures, the higher the alexinomia symptoms. This was a highly significant positive relationship, and colored in dark blue versus light blue, you can also see if a person has a low likelihood of social anxiety or a high likelihood of social anxiety. So these groups were also significantly separatable based on their alexinomia score. This is what you can see here as well. This is a group difference analysis showing the significant difference between people with low levels of social anxiety versus higher levels of social anxiety, and the ones with the higher levels of social anxiety have increased alexinomia symptoms. This graph here shows the same from the other social anxiety measure, the Leibovitz one, but it just shows the same. So this is already what I wanted to share with you in terms of the three studies. Let me also say a few words on where do we stand with this research, where is it going to go. We have some quite a bit of activity planned and ongoing with this topic. We think it's an interesting topic that deserves further research. It's an Alexinomia research program that we are running here at SFU. And besides the studies that have already been completed that I showed you, we are now also in the process of developing a diagnostic instrument to learn about the clinical characteristics and to be able to measure it more precisely, like who has it, who does not have it, and to what severity. And we are also looking into EEG studies, fMRI studies to understand the affective and neural basis of alexinomia. We also want to study in more detail what does it have to do with someone's relationship to their own name. And then, of course, at some point, we would really like to conduct prevalence studies, like how frequent is it in the normal population, in patients with social anxiety, in people from the autism spectrum, and so on. So that would be really interesting to do as well. Of course, there can be also a few other directions that this research can go. Today, I have not said anything about the cultural aspect of the problem and of the topic of alexinomia, but of course there will be huge cultural differences, right? Depending on language, depending on culture, what is the social convention of using names in a certain language, in a certain culture. So far, we have not looked into this. We have only studied German language cases and English language cases. Of course, it would be very interesting to look into the cultural aspects as well. And yeah, also autism, certain vulnerability factors, and also how it affects others. If a person has this problem, how does it affect the people around them? That would be also very interesting to do. Okay, and here are the references. This is already it. This is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking very forward to your questions. I could imagine that maybe from name research, there would be topics that you find interesting that we had not so far on our radar because we are psychologists. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this exciting and very clear presentation of your findings. It sounds like a fascinating project indeed, and I'm pretty sure we would all like to follow the progress and see how your project actually progresses. I was wondering at this point, opening the floor to everyone, there are some questions in the chat. Maria, who gave a paper earlier, she's asking if you could explain again how you differentiate between Alexinomia and the taboo of saying names, for example, in a romantic relationship. Would you perhaps like to say a few more things about that aspect?
Yeah, it goes into this direction, right? So the reports of name taboos in romantic relationships is about the closest thing that we could find amongst name avoidance in anthropological research that relates to this. So name taboos is, for example, not being allowed to say the name of God, for example, in certain cultures, or not being allowed to say your husband names in certain cultures. So the question is, where does these taboos come from? Why is it kind of disrespectful? And on the other hand, in a way, this is also what we find what people with Alexinomia experience. Am I allowed to say the name? Will I say it right? What happens if the other person doesn't like it, how it sounds, how I say it? You know, things like that motivate maybe, or probably, this name avoidance that we see out of the context of a culture where maybe certain names are taboos.
Thank you so much. And Marianne asks, since we're talking about by names, does it work that these individuals choose a new name or a nickname for themselves, for the partner?
For themselves or for the other person?
For the other person, for the partner.
Yeah, it can help in some cases a little bit, but not in all cases. So it's a common strategy that some people described to us, that they would just be using nicknames, right? They can do it if the nickname is a more superficial kind of name, right? A more impersonal kind of name. But if the nickname is also very unique and maybe very emotional, like it is often the case in romantic relationships, you have this very unique name, like unique nickname, right? In that case, for most people, it also doesn't work because it carries the same emotional weight, and it's just the same in that case.
Well, thank you. And Aaron Cleve asks if you found it being more common in women participants in your study or male participants.
Yeah, so far we find that it could be more common in women. So we get contacted much more by women. So we have this website that I showed you, and through this website we get contacted quite a bit. In fact, we get many letters from people who have this problem, and the majority of those is female. In the last study, I showed how this problem relates to social anxiety, and social anxiety is also a psychological phenomenon that is more prevalent in women. So it kind of makes sense. But on the other hand, we don't have any reliable data on the exact prevalence in each genders. So it's something to be looked at more closely.
And from the audience who have raised their hand, Laurel has a question. Yeah, Laurel.
Yes, what a fascinating paper. It's so interesting. I wonder how this intersects with cultural norms. I use myself as an example. I grew up on the East Coast, and in my town and my social context, no one used first names to address each other. And it wasn't because we were uncomfortable doing it, it was just because no one did. So I grew up thinking that was very normal. And then when I moved to California, people noticed that I never called anyone by their names. And I can, but I just don't because that's the way I was brought up. And I have asked my family and my friends about this, and they say, yeah, that's just the way we learned how to do it. So I'm not sure if that's the same as the phenomenon you're describing, but it was definitely a cultural thing for me.
It certainly is. It reminds me of a few conversations that I had last year at a conference. There are quite a few researchers from Japan would come up to me and just tell me, well, this is how we do it. We don't use first names. You only use first names when you get very close to someone. It would be completely impolite and disrespectful to use a first name. So what is it? Do we all have it? Or is it a cultural convention, right? I cannot answer this right now, but so far, the way we have been looking at it, it's what I personally find, of course, the cultural aspects are super interesting, but as a psychologist, as a therapist, what I find very interesting, it's you would like to get close to someone by adding their name to make it more personal. This is the desire. This is the motivation that somebody has. But in that moment, they can't do it because it's just too much for them. And for you, it sounds very different, right? That was not the case. It was a social norm, a social convention.
Just thought a bit on this, and I'm afraid perhaps there's not a lot of time for more questions, but I was wondering, Thomas, could that be the case that depending on the normative standard, you would avoid, so for example, you would avoid saying someone's name. So for example, in Japan, if you would not use the first name, but you would use the second name, let's say, or the surname to address someone, would that be the case that because of Alexinomia, you would be wary of using that name even because that carries the same gravity, let's say?
Exactly. That could well be the case, and it would be something that we would have to check to get this distinction right. Well, what is it exactly?
Yeah. Well, personally, I'm having lots of questions, as more people do, and perhaps if you have time at some point to just reply to some of them on chat during the conference, because it was a very fascinating and thought-provoking paper, and I'm pretty sure that it has raised lots of questions and suggestions as well. Thank you very much, Thomas. If you could all join me into another virtual round of applause for Thomas and his fascinating paper.
Let me just say one last thing, please. If any one of you has some thoughts about this that you would like to share with me, please contact me. You should have my email, right? I'm very interested in exploring this with people from your community more, and so please get in touch.